Good evening. I'm Gavin Cleesby, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I'm happy to welcome you to our program. Before we get started, I just wanted to offer a special welcome to anyone who may be joining us for the first time. If you're not familiar with MHS, we are the first historical society in America, founded in 1791. For the past 230 years, we have been a resource for the public. Today, we maintain a research library. We have galleries open to the public and host a wide variety of programs for both academic and public audiences. That's just a sample of the wide variety of programs we host. We are only able to produce these programs because of the support of our members. We hope you will return for future events, and we hope you will support our work by becoming a member or making a donation. This evening, we'll be hearing from Professor Wendy Rouse from San Jose State University. She is a historian whose scholarly research focuses on the history of women and children in the United States during the Progressive Era. The book she will be speaking on tonight, Public Faces, Secret Lives, A Queer History of the Women's Suffrage Movement, examines how the traditional narrative of the suffrage history sanitized private lives and public personas of individual suffragists, contributing to the historical erasure of the lives and loves of prominent queer suffragists. Yet it was through these intimate partnerships that suffragettes forged powerful personal alliances, often across national and transnational boundaries, that proved essential to propelling the suffrage movement forward. Professor Rouse has previously published 2 books on the history of women and children in the Progressive Era. The latest book, Her Own Hero, The Origins of Women's Self-Defense Movement, examines the political and physical empowerment of women through the practice of boxing and jujitsu in the early 20th century. Her earlier book, The Children of Chinatown, Growing Up Chinese American in San Francisco, considered the significant role of children in the history of Chinese Americans during the era of Chinese exclusion. It's worth noting that due to a technical problem, Professor Rouse was not able to have an internet connection today, so she pre-recorded her talk. Because of this, there will not be a Q&A portion at the end of the program. However, if you do have questions, we'd be more than happy to pass them along and share them with Professor Rouse following the program. So without further ado, I'm going to start the presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. It's so exciting to be here with the Massachusetts Historical Society. So thank you for inviting me. And thank you especially to everyone for tuning in. I really am excited to be able to share some of my research with you, and especially the information that's coming with my new book that comes out this month. And happy Pride Month, everyone. And I thought I might start by explaining a little bit about the woman on the cover of the book. This is Dr. Mary Edwards Walker. In 1880, Dr. Walker, who was a suffragist, was arrested. And when she asked why she was being arrested, the police told her it was because she was wearing men's clothing. Now, she boldly said back to them, "I don't wear men's clothing. I wear my own clothes." So it was Dr. Walker's genderqueer appearance that was totally radical for her time period. And it wasn't the first time that she had been arrested. She'd actually been arrested multiple times for defying gender norms. And she was a lifelong suffragist, a women's rights activist, and a dress reformer. So I've been interested in the history of the suffrage movement for a long time, but I think it was stories like this one that really made me curious about the queer history of the suffrage movement. But every time I kind of proposed this research project to people, they kind of looked at me like, well, maybe there won't be anything out there. You know, how do you know there's going to be enough that's even worth pursuing? And many people suggested that I might not find anything. But I did find something. And in fact, I found so much more than I anticipated. But to be honest with you, their concerns were valid. I mean, they were right to be skeptical, because the truth is that so much of queer history has been erased. And it's in part because of sexism, in part because of homophobia, because of transphobia. These have all played a big role into the erasure of queer history. But suffragists and their descendants are also responsible for this erasure. And so I want to talk a little bit more about that with you today. Let's talk about how during the early 20th century, the idea of women voting was itself an extremely radical idea. I mean, suffragists were pushing the norm for their generation. You had suffrage leaders that were anticipating that with the vote, right, that they would be able to win all of these other rights and reforms. But they also knew that if they were going to get popular support for the vote, they were going to have to present themselves in the most respectable light possible. So this meant, as this picture well demonstrates, this idea of presenting themselves as respectable wives and mothers. And it also meant hiding anyone who didn't really fit in with that image. So Dr. Mary Edwards Walker was viewed as a radical by most mainstream suffragists. So you had suffrage leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who deliberately downplayed Walker's role because they wanted to distance themselves from her. They wanted to distance their organizations from radicals like Walker. So they were essentially attempting to conceal the queerness of the movement by minimizing those types of people. And suffragists tried to erase anything that would make them appear disreputable. Some even hid evidence of their own personal lives, their own love affairs, trying to appear more respectable to the public. So you had queer suffragists would sometimes like literally burn their love letters, burn their diaries. And for others, it wasn't the suffragists themselves, it was their descendants or biographers in later years who contributed to this erasure. So therefore, like the work of the historian becomes so important because we are literally like sifting through the ashes, trying to recover whatever's left, trying to reconstruct these long lost stories. Now, throughout today's presentation, I'm going to use the term queer. And the reason that I use this term is it serves as sort of an umbrella term to describe suffragists who really challenged the gender and sexual norms of their day. Now, if they were alive now, they might use the term lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, etc. But those terms were actually not around at the time that they were alive. So out of respect for them, because they would have never necessarily had the option to use those terms, I'm going to use a broad term, queer, to define anyone who deviated from the gender and sexual norms of their time period. And I want to talk about queer suffragists because they contributed significantly to the suffrage movement. Many of them actually emerged as leaders of the major suffrage organizations, and others were those more radical outcasts like Dr. Mary Edwards Walker. And they were kind of pushing the boundaries of respectability. So when I talk about the queer history of the suffrage movement, I'm talking about those individuals, but I'm also looking at the ways that they defied norms as a whole. So suffragists, whether they were queer or not, by today's term of queer, I'm looking at the way that suffragists themselves queered the movement. So I'm looking at the ways that suffragists queered notions of gender, of sexuality, but also the ways that suffragists queered ideas about family, about domesticity, and even about death. So there's a lot of stories that I could tell you today, and I'm going to focus in on a few stories that come out of the book just to give you an idea of what's in there, and obviously there's so much more in the book itself. So I'll share a few of my favorites with you. This is Annie Tinker, and Annie Tinker was actually born a generation after Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, so she was in the new, like younger suffragists of the early 20th century. And just like Dr. Walker, she refused to conform to the gendered norms of her generation. She dressed completely differently from how women were expected to dress at the time. She acted completely differently. And she really stole the show in a New York City suffrage parade when she emerged in a masculine hat and top hat, leading a cavalry of suffragists on horseback. And the press, they criticized her for her mannish appearance, and other suffragists kind of painted her as an eccentric socialite. But Tinker used her time in the spotlight to advocate for a woman's right, not only to have the vote, but to dress as she pleased and pursue the career of her choice. So again, she was really pushing the norm, queering the norm of her generation. Then there are suffragists like Dr. Margaret Chung. Dr. Chung not only challenged the gender norms of her time period with her clothing and her behavior, but she also called out the xenophobia and the racism both inside and outside the suffrage movement. Now, Chung preferred to be called Mike by her friends. She had her hair, she wore it slicked back, she wore a hat, something like this one, a tailored suit and a cane. And her like whole behavior really deviated from the norm. She liked to drink and gamble and smoke. And she attracted a lot of attention because she was also one of the first Chinese American women physicians in California. And so she leveraged the attention that she received from the press to advocate for women's rights, to talk specifically about the rights of Chinese women in America. And she talked about segregation, and she talked about exclusionary immigration laws. So again, another individual who's queering the norm of her era. Now, this is Alice Dunbar Nelson. And Alice Dunbar Nelson fought not only for women's right to vote, but for the equality of the Black community. Through her speeches, she expressed the belief that with the vote, women could fight back against discrimination and against racialized violence. Publicly, though, she cultivated the image as a respectable, professional, heterosexual woman. She billed herself as Mrs. Paul Lawrence Dunbar, which was the name of her ex-husband. But privately, she had a number of romantic and sexual relationships with both men and women throughout her life. So if she were alive today, she might identify as bisexual or pansexual. But again, that term didn't exist at the time. But we know about her relationships because she mentioned them in some of her letters and her diaries. And she really revealed this like thriving network of lesbian, bisexual women in the Black professional women's movements at the time. So these are just a few of the stories that you can read about more in depth in the book. And the book obviously dives into many, many more stories. And as you read, I want you to remember like how hard it really was to get this information, right? We have these like fragmented stories and they illuminate aspects of queer history. So for today's talk, I thought what I could do is maybe do a deeper dive on one story to give you an idea of the importance of queer suffragists to the movement and to help kind of illuminate this history. So years ago, when I first started this research, I was away on a research trip and I was in an archive and I was just trying to find out like what's out there. Is this project even really worth pursuing? And I'd been in the archive for about a week and I really hadn't found anything that was of any import, really. So I started to think that, okay, maybe everyone's right. I'm not going to really find anything here. And maybe I should just kind of give up and move on. You know, maybe everybody was, it was true what everybody was saying, and I should just walk away from this project. And that's when I found Alice Morgan Wright. So Alice was a suffragist from New York, and I didn't know much about her personal life. I just knew that they had her entire collection there. And I knew that there was some suggestion that she might have been a lesbian or a queer woman, but there wasn't a whole lot of hard facts on this. So I was skimming through her papers, and then I came across poems that she had written in college. And these were just full of pain and love and heartbreak. And she was talking about her love for another woman. And in the poem, young Alice imagines herself as like a king who wins the favor of her fair queen. And the two women live together and love together in a world full of poppies and rainbow mountains, and a world that they kind of created on their own. And here in this world, she says that their love is enough, that they only need each other, that they walk side by side and hand in hand, that theirs is a perfect happiness, and they live in perfect harmony in this secluded little land as long as they remain hidden from view in their own little world, where life is but a fairy song, she writes. But Alice notes that as the sun rises and dawn breaks, she notices that the love dies from her lover's eyes. And the reality dawns, the reality of the world of things that are appears, and the world of things that seem fades away. So as it all comes to an end, Alice continues to cling to this sweet memory of a dream of a potential life that they could have had together. And she said, I just imagine you with me throughout our waking years. So this poem is like profoundly sad. It brought tears to my eyes when I first read it, because I realized that she was talking not only about her queer desire for this other woman, but coming to terms with the reality of living in a world that denied them the ability to be together, to live together, to love openly in the light of day. So her poems as a young college woman were full of queer desire and queer love, but these poems were hidden in the back of some of her old college scrapbooks. They were scribbled on scraps of paper. They were hard to read because they were just drafts, and they were never published, and they were never intended to be seen by others. But we get this glimpse into her queer life. And it reminded me that there's probably more here to uncover I need to look at the scraps. I need to look at the fragments, kind of the in-between places. So as I started to go back through the collection and look more closely at things like this, then I started to uncover Alice's whole queer life. So this picture, I love this picture. She was a hopeless romantic in college, as you can tell from some of her poems. And there are photos like this in her albums. I'm assuming this is one of the women that she probably had a crush on in college. And she fell in love with women. She had several romantic crushes. And what I found is not only little glimpses through poems and through photos like this, but I actually went to letters that were written by other people in other archives about Alice, like friends of Alice talking about Alice. And in those letters, they would talk or hint at her relationships with women. And so this picture, I started to get this picture of her life and about her crushes. And one of the friends that wrote about her in her letters was a friend named Edith Good. And this was Edith's college photo. And so Edith and Alice went to college together. And in Edith's letters to another one of their friends, she talked about how Alice, was in love with this woman, and another woman was in love with Alice. And she joked about how being with Alice is like reading a French novel, a little touch of philosophy, a lot of emotion, and a strange character only partly revealed. So Edith was really skeptical of Alice and her kind of romantic inclinations. Now, after college, this is Alice again, Alice ends up moving to Europe, to Paris for a while, because she wanted to study art. She was a very good sculptress, and she wanted to become a more professional. That was her career that she was pursuing. So she was always a believer in women's suffrage, but her main focus in life was on becoming this famous sculptor. So she crossed the Atlantic to Europe on a steamship, and it was there that she developed yet another crush. But this time it was for Emmeline Pankhurst, who was the leader of the militant suffrage movement in Britain. So this is Emmeline Pankhurst. Now, Alice and Emmeline became friends on the steamship, and Alice was so enamored with this charismatic British suffrage leader. And so Alice wrote letters back to a friend who was at home in New York, and she described her, what I would describe as like a mixture of hero worship and romantic infatuation. And when Emmeline disembarked in London and Alice went on to Paris, Alice continued to write Pankhurst in an attempt to try to keep in touch. And most likely, honestly, Emmeline probably just viewed Alice as one of the many young women who had a crush on her, one of the many young women who was just enamored with her as the leader of the suffrage movement. So I really doubt Emmeline had any feelings for Alice, but Alice clearly had a romantic crush on Emmeline. And so Emmeline would write back to Alice, would talk about what was going on, give her updates on the British suffrage movement. She talked about the marches and the arrests and the imprisonment of the British suffragettes, and really, talked about the glory of being a part of this movement. Now, what you need to know is at this point in time in Britain, the suffragists were completely fed up. The militant suffragists had spent years, they had petitioned the government, they had begged the men in power for the vote, and they saw zero change. So under Emmeline Pankhurst's leadership, the suffragists began to shift tactics, and they began to use marches and they began to use demonstrations to try to get the government's attention. Eventually, though, this led to violent confrontations with the police. And you've probably heard of some of these, right? The suffragists were physically attacked, they were sexually assaulted. In one infamous suffrage demonstration, which later became known as Black Friday, there was complete violence. It ended in violence when the police began to brutally beat hundreds of suffragists in the streets of London. And Emmeline's own sister died from injuries sustained on Black Friday. So at this point, she decided that enough was enough, and she declared that it was time for suffragists to fight back, to use deeds and not words. And so she gave this fiery speech, this famous speech, to a crowd of women in London. And she said, "Why should we go to Parliament Square and be battered and insulted? We've submitted for years to insult and assault. Women have lost their lives." So essentially she was saying enough is enough. She said, "We're no longer going to allow the government to break our bodies. Instead, she called on suffragists to break glass, to destroy property in protest. Now, Alice was reading about all of this from Paris. She was reading it in the newspapers, and she was getting letters from Emmeline about what was happening. She was so tired of just sitting and watching. She couldn't handle it anymore. So she travels to London in March of 1912, and she actually participates in this mass window breaking campaign. She's literally arrested holding a stone with a note wrapped around it that said, "Taxation without representation is tyranny." Now, the judge, after she was arrested, the judge was not happy, and the judge sentenced her to 2 months in jail, along with hundreds of other suffragists who were arrested that night. In fact, this was her arrest paper. Now, you can imagine what impact this might have back in the United States as it makes headline news. Her parents, living in upstate New York at the time, they panic upon hearing this news that their daughter had been arrested in London. And the newspaper headlines dramatically announced that an American girl has been arrested in London. So her father panics. He immediately starts consulting with lawyers. Her mother actually rushes over to England on a steamship as fast as she could in those days. And her goal is to plead for her daughter's freedom. Meanwhile, in jail, the suffragists decide that the protest is not over. They're going to continue the fight. So they launch a hunger strike. And Alice goes on hunger strike with them. She refuses to take any food. And of course, the response of the government then, because they don't want any suffragists dying and becoming martyrs on their time, the government starts to force feed the suffragists. Nurses literally held the women down. Doctors shoved plastic tubes down their throats or through their nostrils, and they poured raw eggs and milk directly into their stomachs. The suffragists vomited, they bled, and they endured great pain from these violent procedures. Some were so weak by the hunger strike and by the force feedings that they grew deathly ill. Now, together in prison, in jail, they tried to keep their spirits up. They sang suffrage songs, and they rallied to each other's side. They cared for each other in sickness. And behind the bars of Holloway, Alice was there hunger striking, and she was most worried about Emmeline Pankhurst. Pankhurst was also imprisoned with them, but she had been separated from the other suffragists, so she couldn't interact with them. So Alice sat in her cell and bided her time by writing poems to Pankhurst. And I found these poems in Alice Morgan Wright's collection on little tiny pieces of paper that were written on jail paper. And these are the poems. They're very difficult to read, but they express her queer infatuation, desire, her queer crush on Emmeline Pankhurst. So here's one of them. It says, "4 walls go round my prison cell, and somewhere beyond there your cell is. Can prison walls put out the stars or take away my love for you? What if today and yesterday have given me no sight of you? It is enough the whole night through to think perhaps tomorrow may. I think although you do not know, your heart must be a little gay because of me, since day by day and hour by hour, I love you so." Now, Alice was so crushed on Emmeline that she even sculpted a bust. This was a very small, tiny bust out of clay. This clay she had smuggled in with her socks, and she took the time while she was in prison to create this bust in honor of Emmeline. So even though no romance ever developed between Alice and Emmeline, this is just an example of like the queer crushes, the queer friendships that did exist in the suffrage movement. And there were friendships, there were crushes, there were sexual affairs that helped bind suffragists together in common cause and helped forge alliances across the Atlantic. Now, queer suffragists were among the first to go to the front lines. They were among the first to submit their bodies to police assault, the first to endure arrests, imprisonment, hunger strikes, and force feeding for the cause. So while Alice is in Europe and all of this is happening, her old college chum, Edith Good, was also fighting for women's right to vote back in the United States. Now, Edith actually worked with the National Women's Party or at this time it was called the Congressional Union. And she traveled across the country on a speaking tour to try to enlist the support of Western women in the campaign for the federal amendment. Edith helped launch the militant suffrage campaign, what became known as the Silent Sentinels. They were inspired by the activism of the British suffragists. And so the Congressional Union started to picket the White House. They were arrested, and just like their British counterparts, they continued to protest in prison, went on hunger strike, and endured forced feedings. Now, Edith was one of the organizers of this campaign. So here again, you see queer suffragists. They're among the first to go to the front lines, the first to submit their bodies to police assault, the first to endure arrest, imprisonment, hunger strikes, and forced feeding for the cause. So when Alice returned from Europe, this is Alice here with the sculpture in her hand, she reunited with her old college chum, again, Edith, who had been working with the Silent Sentinels. And it was really the suffrage movement that bound them back together, and they became really good friends again. And it was the suffrage movement and their common experiences that made them even closer. They continued to campaign for the vote. Even after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, they worked together on the National Women Party's campaign for the Equal Rights Amendment. And Edith no longer seemed to object to Alice's philosophical, emotional, and strange character. In fact, it seems she began to like it. In the years after their career as suffragists, they became partners. They never married any men, and they instead chose to live their lives with each other. And like so many of the queer suffragists that I studied, they formed their own chosen family. They created their own community, their own friendship network. They maintained their own separate homes. They spent months at a time living and traveling together, and they went on extended vacations together. Edith had a family farm in Woodstock, Vermont, and so Wright opens up an art studio there for when they're staying in Vermont. And friends would come and visit them. Friends frequently inquired about the other in each other's letters, and they would address correspondence to both of them. Now, as I mentioned, they continued their activism well beyond the campaign for the vote, working on the Equal Rights Amendment. And during these photos, this is around 1945, Alice and Edith actually worked together with a delegation of women from around the world to demand that the United Nations adopt a declaration of full equality for women, and that they create a commission on the status of women. So Alice and Edith are perhaps both most well known in their life, not only for their dedication in the suffrage movement and for the ERA and for their work on the United Nations campaign, but in the latter half of their life, they actually worked together for animal rights. And together they founded the National Humane Education Society, working for the humane treatment of animals. So there's a picture of Alice later in her life when they were running an animal rescue, and Alice had lots of animals that she had cared for and rescued. So they lived this long life together, working together as activists, a variety of causes. But honestly, like uncovering the nature of their relationship was difficult at times, in part because I never was able to locate the letters that they wrote to each other. Now, I've already mentioned to you that this should come as really no surprise, right? Because we know that queer history gets erased. And we know that much of the reason this gets erased has to do with homophobia and transphobia, right? All of, and sexism. So what I had to do is do a lot of reading between the lines to piece together their life. So what I found was that in old notebooks, there were unfinished drafts of Valentine's Day poems that Alice had written and dedicated to Edith. And sometimes these were only marked with her initials. So you could see up here, it says EJG, which is for Edith Good. And this was written in February 14th of 1927. And again, these were not the final copies that she probably gave, that Alice gave to Edith. And again, they were never published or given to anyone else, but these are the draft copies in the back of her old notebooks. And these poems attest to Alice's deep love for Edith. They define her enduring love, their enduring relationship. And so these are very sentimental, very sweet poems. She's talking here about Edith in a white cap and red jacket, pine trees and snow. My love in the winter woods, eyes like a doe. So it's very sweet. She's talking about her love in the woods. Edith in the woods. Now later on, she continued to write Valentine's Day poems every year. And later on, their poems even get more contemplative about their life together. One of the ones she wrote later on in life said, my hands are torn by the spokes I clutch as the willing years go by. And the dust of their passing graze my head. And my eyes are dim with the dust they shed. And think how year by year I love my lovely dear. She is my noonday bright. She is my starry night. She is my heart's delight, my very dear. So these are very sweet, sentimental love poems that they wrote to each other later in life. Now, Alice and Edith both had their share of health problems as they aged, and they actually took turns kind of caring for each other at different points in their life. At one point, they actually ended up in the hospital together at the same time. And there's this really kind of sweet story when Alice was writing to a friend, and she said, we still stayed connected though. She said, every morning at 10:30, I hobble across the street and I wave at her window from at first her nurse, and then she waves back at me. So it was very cute. They tried to keep connected even when they were separated in these ways. And again, I want to return to the fact that I had no correspondence directly between the two of them. And it was a big mystery to me because there was so much in Alice's files. There was like every letter she'd written, right? There's so much that had been saved. And yet there was nothing directly between the two of them. So I really wondered about this for quite some time. And I was thinking that there's something missing here. And I think that that's where so much of queer history is important, is to look for what we call the archival silences. What's not there and why isn't it there? So one day I found a hint actually about what happened. And what I found is that in 1967, Alice had gotten very ill and they thought she may not make it. So Edith began making plans in case she was going to pass away. And there was a note from Edith to a friend of theirs. And she said, while they were sorting through Alice's letters, she said, I want to read every scrap of Alice's memoranda that I have assembled, as well as her correspondence with me over the years. So what essentially happened is that they did have letters that they had written each other. But at this point where they thought that Alice was going to pass away, Edith removed those letters from Alice's collection. I do not know what she did with them, but my guess is that she wanted to get rid of any material that might make them look unfavorable to future generations. Maybe they were too intimate, but they did exist and they were removed from that collection by Edith. Now, actually what happens is Edith passes away before Alice. And this happened in 1970. And Edith was laid to rest in the Good family plot in Springfield, Ohio. And Alice was devastated because Alice had requested in various iterations of her will that they be buried next to each other in the family plot in the Albany Cemetery. She wanted them to be buried together in her family plot in Albany, New York. So this never happened. But what I did find, and again, looking at the in-between places, I found in the back of an old address book, there was like a scribbled note that Alice had written, a kind of reflection, and it revealed her deep grief and her regret that they were never buried together. She said, my wanting leaves something to be desired. My writing leaves something to be desired. But I should never forget these two names, Edith Good and Alice Wright. I believe there's never been a moment in all these years when I haven't put our two names together. Why on earth didn't I enter these names together the last time, not long ago, when I asked you to put us together? So again, she clearly wanted them to be buried together, and it never happened. 5 years later, when she passes away, she's interred in the family plot in Albany. So although their final wish of never being buried together never happened, Alice did succeed in establishing an endowed trust under both of their names. And it was the Alice Morgan Wright and Edith Good Fund. And it was created in both of their memories to support the National Humane Education Society and to continue to memorialize their loving relationship together and their love of animals. So it's really fascinating to think about these women's lives well beyond even the suffrage movement. Because if you think about it, like queer suffragists, they cared for each other during the movement, they loved each other, but even in death, right? Even beyond in their later parts of their life and in death, they continue to care and support each other. So I actually have a whole chapter in the book that deals with death, in part because I began to realize that there was a whole nother way I could uncover their lives and kind of learn more about who their relationships were by going through things like probate records, death, and cemetery records. And what I found is that queer suffragists adopted, adapted, and even queered heteronormative death rituals. So monuments and memorials allowed suffragists to preserve the memory and remain connected to their partners even after death. So if I could turn for just a second to a different story, I want to talk about Dr. Mary Sperry and Gail Laughlin. Now, these two suffragists are actually from California, so they're from my state, and they're local Bay Area suffragists. And they actually worked together on the California state suffrage campaign. When they met through the suffrage movement. And Gail Laughlin was an attorney, and she was hired to work on the campaign by the California State Suffrage Association. And so she was brought out to California to work on the campaign as an organizer. And she met Dr. Mary Sperry because Dr. Mary Sperry's mother, who was also named Mary Sperry, was the president of the California Suffrage Association. So Laughlin stayed in the Sperry family home while she was working on the suffrage campaign. Now, it was at this point that she met Dr. Sperry and fell in love with her. And they actually lived together as a couple for 14 years. They, at one point, they moved to Colorado together, and they lived together. And Dr. Sperry practiced her work as a physician, and Gail Laughlin was in private practice as an attorney. And eventually, they moved back to California together. Now, their relationship ended after 14 years because Dr. Mary Sperry died in the influenza epidemic around 1919. But in her will, Dr. Sperry left her property to Laughlin, and she requested that her bodily remains be given to Laughlin as well. Now, this decision completely infuriated her mother and the entire Sperry family. They contested her will in court, and they began to accuse Laughlin of being, quote, mannish. Now, this was essentially the code at the time for implying that someone was lesbian. Again, they didn't use the word lesbian, but they would often refer to a woman as mannish or masculine. And the implication was that therefore she was, abnormal sexually, a deviant, essentially what we would define as a lesbian in later years. So Sperry's mother told the judge that Laughlin and Sperry even slept together in the same bed. So she told this to try to show that their relationship was unnatural so that she could therefore contest Dr. Sperry's request that Laughlin take all of her property and care for her remains. Now, the case was settled, and the court essentially upheld Sperry's will, Sperry's final wishes. And especially they upheld her request that Laughlin care for her physical remains. Now, the Sperry family was completely furious. They were so mad that they actually had inscribed on their own family plot here in California, they had the phrase in memoriam subscribed with Dr. Sperry's name. So they were essentially saying that her rightful place was there in California with the family in the family plot. So this is what it looks like. I took a picture myself because it's not far from where I live. It says in memoriam, Mary A. Sperry, California. So, but Mary Sperry's body is not there because Laughlin was willed her ashes. So carrying out her wishes, Laughlin kept Sperry's ashes with her for the rest of her life. And when Laughlin dies, like almost 40 years later in 1952, she requested that the remains of both of them be interred together in the same grave in the Laughlin family plot, with both of their names etched together on a single marker. So I also took this picture. It's in Maine, in where Laughlin's family is buried. And this simple brass marker commemorates their life together and their commitment to each other, not just in this life, but beyond. So one of the purposes of learning history, right, is to be able to find ourselves in the past, to be able to see ourselves. And we know how important this is for all of us. but it's especially important for marginalized groups, for queer people specifically, because it's so rare for us to be able to see ourselves represented in history. But these stories of oppression, of survival, of persistence, of even resistance, they're so crucial to us. So that's why these stories of queer suffragists are so important. They were so important to me to recover, and why queer history is so important for us to learn, to teach, and to pass on. So thank you very much for listening today, and I'm glad to be able to share my research with you. It would be great now to answer some of the common questions that I have, and a few questions that have come in. Some people ask me what the biggest challenge was here for finding details about these women's lives. And I kind of mentioned this in the presentation, but obviously erasure is a significant problem. For example, in this case with Laughlin and Sperry, even though we have this marker that clearly attests to their life together, there was attempts to erase their life together. So for example, there was a biography written in 1979 of Gail Laughlin. And it's a little booklet, actually. It's quite a lengthy, I think it's like 70 pages. And in that booklet, they only mention Sperry once, and she's mentioned as a close friend. And it's interesting because clearly the person who wrote the biography and the people who gathered the information knew about Laughlin. It was a relative of Laughlin. They knew about her burial. They knew about Sperry, I'm sure. So this essentially erases her in the biography, right? That Sperry has no meaning in her life at all. And so you can kind of see this, like how people get erased from history, how partners of suffragists get erased from history. And so you can see why it's so important to uncover this history. It takes a lot of looking at, like I said, at the in-between places, like at the scribbled notes in the back of notebooks, or the back of the address book in Alice Morgan Wright's case. And again, it also means, like I said, searching the archival silences, asking what's there, what's not there. If it's not there, where did it go? Does it even still exist? Can I find it? Or was it destroyed? And if so, by whom and why? So it essentially leads to a lot more questions. I also mentioned Annie Tinker in this presentation, and I talk more about her in the book. And this was another good example of erasure. There were actually lots of letters of her throughout her life, but not written by her directly. There wasn't a lot, I couldn't find a lot of her letters, but there's a lot of letters written about her by friends. And I actually found correspondence between one of her, quote, friends, possibly a former lover, and her attorney, because when Annie Tinker passed away, she had willed all of her property and whatnot to one of her former friends / former lovers. And they started talking about Tinker's reputation, because she was a partier, she liked to drink, but she also had a reputation with women. So essentially what they end up doing is destroying all of her letters. And so there's hard examples of that in the book, of this erasure. And another challenge of doing this research was just convincing people that it was a worthy project. Women's history is always difficult to get funded and get support for, but queer history is especially difficult. So what I found is that it took a lot of effort to get people to think that this was a worthy project. And it really wasn't until there was discussions about the Centennial celebration in 2020 that I found people start to be interested in this topic and kind of reach out and start to ask, how they could support the project. So I think, giving more attention to women's history and queer history is so important. Another question here was there any stories of individuals that called to me? And if so, why? It's tough. There's so many stories in the book and so many people that call to me. But honestly, Alice Morgan Wright's story was one of my favorites. And I think that's why I chose to focus this presentation on that. Her life, falling in love, losing love, finding love again. I think we can all relate to aspects of that. Like, we've all had experiences like that in our life. And so her story to me was especially compelling. Another really interesting story in the book that called to me was the story of Eugene DeForest. If he were alive today, he might identify as a trans man, but again, those terms didn't exist at the time. He lived in San Jose in the Bay Area, which is where I'm from, in California. And he's interesting because he created a chosen family of suffragists. His story is relatable, in part because he had lived in my hometown, but also because he really fought his whole life to try to live as his true self. And then he created this adopted chosen family of suffragists. So you can read more about him in the book. But there's so many stories, and it's hard to focus on just one, but I give you some idea of what's in the book here. Another question is, how did writing this book shift my understanding of the suffrage movement? So I've taught the history of women's suffrage for over 20 years. I teach about it every time I teach a US history class. And I've always really thought of it as this perspective of women fighting for the vote, right? That primarily they're fighting for the vote. And I never really thought about the range of individuals in the movement, the variety of women. And I never really thought about what their individual motives might have been and how they might have envisioned a much larger movement, much more than just the right to vote. And so for queer suffragists especially, this meant fighting not only for their right to vote, right, but for their right to be who they wanted to be and to love who they wanted to love. So I want to thank you all very much for inviting me here again to talk. And I hope that you find the book compelling and interesting, and definitely check it out. It's available on Amazon, but it's also available through the university website at nyupress.org. And check it out. Let me know how you like it. And you can tweet me if you're on Twitter at Wendy L. Rouse. And thank you again for having me here today.
I want to thank everyone for joining us. If, as I said by a chat message, if you have questions for the author, we would be happy to pass them on, and you can send them to us at programs@masshist.org, and we will be sure to pass them along. So thank you all, and have a good night.